I'm Faith Harwell, 30 years old. And the night I thought I'd celebrate quietly in my apartment became the night my entire life detonated when my father appeared at my door holding a sealed envelope and said, "Your grandmother left this for you," though God knows why she bothered. I stood there stunned, hearing him add that she'd died believing I would never amount to anything. And the cold steadiness in his voice cut through me harder than the words themselves. I took the envelope from his hand while he reminded me he had other places to be. And I watched him walk away without waiting for a reply. I closed the door behind me. Still holding the envelope, he delivered as if it were an obligation he regretted fulfilling. I sat at my kitchen table with the candle on my birthday cake barely lit when I broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. And the first line stopped my breath as my grandmother's handwriting told me, "If you're reading this, it means you survived your parents." My hands trembled as I whispered, "Survived them," because the certainty in her tone felt like she had been speaking from a place far deeper than simple affection. The brass key taped beneath the letter shifted when I lifted the page. And the tiny scrape it made against the table felt louder than my own breathing. Nothing in my father's warning prepared me for the sentence that followed. The one that told me she had hidden the truth for years and left it only for me to find. I read her final line again, realizing she had trusted me with something my father clearly wanted buried. And the weight of that knowledge changed the room around me, as if the walls themselves understood before I did. I walked into First Bank the next morning with the letter folded in my coat pocket. And when I handed the brass key to the clerk, she glanced at the number and said she needed to call her branch manager because access on this box was set under strict instructions. I waited at her desk, wondering what my grandmother had anticipated, while the manager approached with a measured nod and told me, "Ms. Harwell, your name is the only one authorized." And your grandmother emphasized that no exceptions were to be made. He led me through the quiet corridor lined with metal doors. And the echo of his statement stayed with me as he unlocked box 1247 and stepped aside to let me open it myself. I pulled the drawer forward and saw a manila folder, a sealed envelope, and a leather portfolio arranged with deliberate precision. I sat on the small bench as I opened the folder and read the title, "Last Will and Testament of Frances Whitford, executed May 22. 2019. And the shock hit me when the first paragraph named me as the sole beneficiary of her trust and her house in Estes Park. I whispered, "This isn't the will they read." And the weight of the signature page in my hands made the memory of my father's smug certainty feel suddenly fragile. Beneath the will lay bank statements showing structured withdrawals from the trust in amounts that matched Derek's tuition and Richard's investment figures he used to brag about at family dinners. I read the totals twice, realizing the same money my father claimed never existed had been quietly drained under his authority. I opened the leather portfolio next and found notarized confirmations and a short note from my grandmother that said she had hidden the truth because she trusted I would seek it when I was ready. And those words landed with a clarity that made my throat tighten. I lifted the smaller envelope last and found a single sentence in her handwriting telling me to contact Marcia Doyle if anything ever felt wrong. I closed the box with the certainty that something had been very wrong for a long time. And the documents in my hands finally showed me how deep that wrong went. I drove to the address written in my grandmother's note and found Marcia Doyle waiting in her doorway with a calm nod. And she said she'd been expecting my call ever since, Frances told her. Faith will come when the truth finally finds her. She led me inside and listened as I described the 2019 will. And when I finished, she said my father had filed the 2014 version instead, knowingly submitting a document that no longer held legal authority. I asked how she could be certain, and she replied that she had notarized the 2019 will herself and watched my grandmother sign it with a steady hand. I felt my pulse climb because every word Marcia spoke aligned perfectly with the papers I'd pulled from that vault. She opened her briefcase and handed me certified duplicates of the documents. And she explained that executor fraud doesn't disappear just because 5 years have passed, which made my breath catch as she placed the confirmations in front of me. I asked her why no one confronted my father when the estate went through probate. And she told me he'd insisted the newer file never existed and pressured the family's attorney into accepting his claim. I told her the bank records showed trust withdrawals matching my father's investments and Derek's tuition. And she nodded slowly, as if each number confirmed a suspicion she had carried alone. She said my grandmother had anticipated exactly this outcome and made sure the evidence stayed out of Richard's reach. I asked her what my options were now. And she told me I could pursue criminal charges or negotiate a full settlement. But either path would require confronting him directly. I asked why my grandmother hadn't told me while she was alive. And Marcia said, Frances believed I needed time to stand firmly enough to face what she knew would come. I sat there, absorbing her words as she added that she had held on to everything because Frances made her promise to protect the truth until I was ready to carry it myself. I thanked her as I gathered the documents into my bag and realized that the truth my grandmother hid for 5 years had finally stepped out of the shadows and into my hands. My father texted me 2 days later telling me to come to the house at 7 for a family conversation. And when I walked into his study, he didn't look up before saying he'd heard I'd been digging in places that were none of my concern. I told him I'd accessed the safe deposit box my grandmother assigned only to me. And he replied that whatever I thought I found was misinterpreted nonsense that could embarrass the family if repeated. Victoria stood near the window, insisting this was all a misunderstanding that could be handled quietly. While Derek shifted in his chair as my father warned that people might question my stability if I continued stirring up fantasies about documents that never existed. I kept my voice even as I said the 2019 will did exist. And the notary signature alone proved it. He leaned back and told me I clearly didn't understand estate law, adding that your grandmother was confused near the end, which made Derek glance up sharply as if hearing the line for the first time. I reminded him the handwriting and dates were unmistakable. And he replied that I had always been too emotional to read situations accurately. A claim I refused to absorb this time. Victoria stepped forward, telling me to respect the strain this was placing on their household. But her tone broke slightly when I mentioned the trust withdrawals tied directly to Derek's tuition. My father interrupted me to say those expenses were his right as executor, repeating that I was only proving how unstable I'd become by obsessing over old paperwork. I told him I hadn't imagined the amounts or the signatures, and he warned that my job at the library might not appreciate hearing about erratic behavior from someone working around sensitive records. I answered that intimidation wasn't going to change what was written in front of me. And Derek whispered my name, sounding uncertain for the first time since I arrived. My father snapped at him to stay out of it and told me to drop the matter before I humiliated myself, insisting no one would believe I had any idea what I was talking about. I stood long enough to say I'd see him at the gala he was so proud of, then walked out knowing he'd heard in my voice that I finally meant every word. I met with Marcia the next afternoon and told her my father wanted the matter buried before the gala. And she said, "Then, the gala is exactly where he'll be forced to hear the truth," as she spread the certified documents across her desk with the certainty of someone who had waited years for this moment. I asked how a pool of donors and board members would help, and she answered that Richard valued those people more than any court ruling, which made the setting stronger than any private negotiation he thought he could control. I agreed that I wanted him confronted where his confidence lived, and she said she would attend the event as a guest of an art patron who owed her a favor. I left her office carrying the evidence in a slim folder that felt heavier with every step, because I finally understood what it meant to choose my battleground. Later that night, I received a call from Victoria, reminding me to dress appropriately for your father's recognition. And she said the Denver Art Museum expected a polished family presence since reporters might be there. I told her I knew exactly what kind of presence I intended to bring, and she replied that she hoped I wouldn't create unnecessary tension on an evening designed to honor Richard's philanthropy. I answered that any tension would come from the truth he'd spent years hiding. and she hesitated long enough for me to imagine her calculating what that might mean for the polished image she guarded. When she ended the call with a clipped "just be mindful," I finally felt the advantage shift. The next morning, Marcia reviewed the order in which I would speak if given the microphone. And she said, "You don't accuse him first. You let the document speak before he has time to twist your words." I repeated the phrasing she suggested, grounding each line in the uncontestable dates and signatures that matched every page in our folder. She told me the witnesses to the 2019 will had agreed to attend the gala quietly, and the knowledge that they would be present tightened the entire plan into something undeniable. When I walked out of her office, I knew the gala would no longer be his celebration, but the place where the lie finally met the truth. I arrived at the Denver Art Museum to find my father already surrounded by donors as he laughed about the growth of Harwell urban development. And when he saw me, he said, "Good. You made it. Just remember, this evening isn't about your concerns." I told him I wasn't there to cause trouble, and he replied that he expected nothing less than graceful behavior from me, especially with reporters circulating near the front tables. Victoria stepped closer to remind me the gala honored Richard's contributions to the arts. Yet her voice tightened when I said my grandmother had contributed something too, just not in the way he wanted anyone here to know. Derek stood a few feet away watching us as if he sensed the ground shifting beneath the polished room. The program began with a curator praising Richard's unwavering integrity. And as the applause rose, he stepped to the podium and said he'd learned everything about responsibility from my late mother, Frances Whitford. I felt a cold clarity settle over me when he added that she had believed deeply in his ability to guide the family, because every document in my bag contradicted that sentence line for line. When he finished and the room applauded again, I raised my voice enough to be heard and asked if I could say something about my grandmother as well. He froze for a fraction before saying the family would be honored to hear from me. And the microphone was placed in my hand with several curious eyes following the exchange. I walked forward and said I wanted to speak about the legacy my grandmother intended to leave. And I opened the folder as I explained that she had signed a will in 2019, naming me the beneficiary of her estate. My father stepped toward the edge of the stage and said I was confused, insisting the 2014 will had been her final directive and that I was misremembering under stress. I held up the certified copy bearing her signature and told the room the document he submitted to probate was not the most recent version. And he answered sharply that I had no understanding of legal procedures. Several guests murmured when I read the clause designating me the rightful heir while he was to receive a modest amount. And the shift in the room's energy pulled Richard's composure taut. I continued by stating that the trust had been drawn down without authorization. And I read the withdrawal amounts that matched Derek's tuition and my father's investments line by line. Richard said those funds were his to manage as executor. But his voice rose when I said an executor only has authority under a valid will, which the 2014 document was not once the 2019 version existed. Victoria whispered to him that people were staring, but he shook her off and told the room this was family drama exaggerated by a daughter who'd always struggled with perspective. I answered that the notary and both witnesses to the 2019 will were present tonight. And the silence that followed landed harder than anything I'd said so far. Marcia stepped forward from her table and said she had notarized the 2019 will personally and had retained copies because Frances feared exactly this scenario. And Richard snapped that she was meddling in matters beyond her role. I said the estate would need to be corrected, and that all assets designated to me must be transferred along with restitution for the trust withdrawals. And he answered that I had no authority to demand anything. I told him I did have authority once the proper will was recognized, and that he could comply now or allow the Colorado Attorney General's office to review the filings starting Monday. The room stayed still as he looked between my face and the documents that held everything he'd assumed would never surface. He said I was ungrateful and trying to destroy him on the night meant to honor his work. And I replied that I had only brought the truth he had chosen to hide. He said the truth was subjective in family matters. But I told him dates, signatures, and bank records were not. And his expression cracked just enough for the nearest tables to see what he'd been trying to mask. For a long moment, he stood behind the podium, gripping its edge as though it might steady him. Then he whispered that we would discuss this privately. But I said the discussion had already begun in the place where he valued reputation above everything else. When I lowered the microphone and stepped away, the applause that rose wasn't for him. And he understood that before anyone else did. The settlement was finalized 2 weeks after the gala, when my father's attorney called Marcia to say Richard would transfer the remaining trust balance, sign over the Estes Park house, and repay the unauthorized withdrawals. And when I heard those terms, I said, "I only want what was mine from the beginning." He refused to speak to me directly, though his attorney added that Richard believed I had overreacted publicly, a phrasing that revealed he still clung to the idea that truth was negotiable if spoken loudly enough. Victoria filed for divorce soon after and told Derek she couldn't rebuild a life with someone who'd lied to an entire room. And hearing that from him later made me realize the gala had broken more than one illusion that night. I signed the final documents, knowing nothing about this outcome, felt like victory so much as breathing air I hadn't tasted in years. Derek asked to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. And as he sat across from me, he said he hadn't understood where the money came from, adding that he should have asked questions long before now. I reminded him the withdrawals matched his tuition exactly, and he admitted he'd accepted the support because it was easier than examining what fairness actually looked like in our family. I told him change wasn't owed to me but to himself, and he nodded with a quiet resolve that sounded different from the confidence he once wore so easily. When he thanked me for giving him space to grow instead of cutting him out, I realized he was trying to rebuild without pretending the past hadn't happened. I spent the following months returning to my work at the library with a steadiness I hadn't felt before. And when people asked why I stayed, I told them the job had never been the problem. I visited the house in Estes Park and walked through the rooms my grandmother once filled with softness, saying aloud that I finally understood what she had tried to protect. I kept her letter on my desk at home and read it whenever I needed to remember that truth only hurts until it sets something free. When the last of the legal paperwork arrived, confirming the estate had been corrected, I closed the envelope and let myself imagine a future shaped not by what my father feared losing, but by what I had finally gained. When I finally closed the last envelope and felt the quiet settle around me, I said that anyone who stayed with me through this story has shared more than just a moment. I told them their voices matter here if they want to leave a thought or a feeling behind. And as I stepped into the calm I'd been reaching for, I asked them to stay connected if they want to walk with me toward whatever peace comes next.